Let me introduce myself. I'm Cora Fox, and I'm an associate professor in the English department, and I'm also the associate director of the Institute for Humanities Research. I've been part of the ACMRS study group on emotions that is linked to the Australian Research Council Center for Excellence for the Study of the History of Emotion. Is that right? Wow. I think I came close to capturing that. But anyway, so I've been involved in that, and I am working on this project to present it actually in Australia. And so Bob asked if I would also present it here. And so it's still a work in progress. It's a new area for my research. My first book was about grief and rage. And it was very focused on sort of literary moments of grief and rage. And so I'm sort of stretching and moving outside of that to think about how literature can be in dialogue with the cognitive sciences in terms of defining emotional states. And so that's what this work is. So, myth on happiness in Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. Yes. When Paulina famously pauses in the final scene of the Winter's Tale before she reveals that the statue of Hermione is Hermione herself, she tells her on-stage and off-stage audience, "It is required you do awake your faith." In this emotive speech act, Paulina, who is the commissioner of the supposed statue and the stage manager of the scene, draws attention to the play's affective experimentation and its dependence on the imaginative generosity of its audience, as they are obliged to embrace the effect that viewing the metamorphic statue will have on them. The king, Leontes, who believes himself, I'm actually going to back up for a second and tell you, just in case you're not as familiar with the play, a little bit about how we get to this moment at the very end. So for those of you who haven't seen it for a while or have never seen it, it's a classic romance. It involves long journeys and long stretches of time. And basically, it's also part of a group of plays that Shakespeare wrote. Shakespeare was very interested in the cuckold narrative and the idea that men are afraid that women are cheating on them. I say that he was interested in men's fear about it because there are about 5 plays that are, the entire plot is a man is convinced that his wife is unfaithful, turns out she isn't, but he does all kinds of destructive things to her and to the community. And then in the end it's revealed that the woman was actually not unfaithful. It's a very interesting fact, in fact, that there aren't any women who are actually guilty of adultery in the plays. They're always falsely accused. And so this is one of those plays, and it's one of his last versions of this narrative, right? And in The Winter's Tale, it opens with Leontes the king, a man standing there trying to touch his wife, and there isn't really much explanation at all for why he's just gone crazy. He's crazy with jealousy and rage. He's sure that she has committed adultery with his best friend, Polixenes, and his rage he ends up arresting his wife, trying to kill his best friend, all for reasons that are not clear, and his best friend flees with his most loyal servant, and his wife is imprisoned. Her 5-year-old son dies of grief. Her daughter, gives birth to an infant in prison who is sent to be exposed to die out in the woods because she has, oops, now I really messed things up. Can you help me get back to the, while I explain the rest? So the daughter is exposed, but it turns out that she didn't actually die, and 16 years later she comes back and is, the daughter comes back and it turns out that the wife, who passed out in the midst of all of this, all of these accusations, it turns out that she's been hidden away by Paulina, this faithful woman who is standing here. She's been hidden away in some secret place, we don't know exactly where, and she's presented to the king and the rest of the court as a statue, and then she comes to life because she actually is still alive. So she's still lost, in the end, her losses are, she's still lost her 5-year-old son who died of separation from his mother in some way, but the daughter and the mother are reunited after the 16 years. So there's sort of a partial reconciliation of the family at the end. So I apologize, that was kind of a brief synopsis, but that's what's happening. So the king, Leontes, who believes himself guilty of Hermione's death and her lost daughter Perdita, have already threatened to touch and kiss the statue. So overwhelmed are they with desire for what they believe is an artful representation, a copy of Hermione, the wronged wife and mother. As many critics have noted, and anyone who has seen the play performed can attest, the audience is as moved to awe to see Hermione alive after 16 years as the onstage witnesses. And in performance, as opposed to when you're reading the text, where the scene lists Hermione as a character, so you know she's still there, when you see it in performance, it's not clear until the moment of transformation whether the scene is going to revolve around an actor playing the statue of her, or an actor playing Hermione who is pretending to be a statue, right? So there's a lot of play with meta-theater here. The mixed emotions of surprise, relief, wonder, and joy are shared in this meta-theatrical way with the audience, and the awe produced in Leontes, Perdita, and the assembled courtiers extends to the playgoers as they experience the emotions produced by this sublime moment of stagecraft. So what Shakespeare sets up at the end here is you have this statue that comes to life. There's an audience on the stage watching the statue come to life, and they're very much implicated in one because it's their mother and wife, right? And then there's us, the audience, watching the audience watch this moment. So it's a highly overdetermined moment of stagecraft. An audience in Shakespeare's playhouse would have been even more surprised to see the statue come to life, since The Winter's Tale, which was probably first performed in 1611, but may have been written a little bit earlier than that, is a self-conscious revision of a recent and popular romance, Robert Greene's Pandosto, which was published in 1588. So very close, right? It's not even a far intertext. In which the parallel Hermione character stays dead. She dies, and that's the end of the story. It's also an overt rewriting of the Pygmalion myth, mainly as it's told in Ovid's Metamorphoses, in which Pygmalion desires the statue of a woman he has created because he could not abide the wickedness of real women. Pygmalion creates the statue because he has seen the behavior of the Propides, who are the first prostitutes, and he is rewarded for this misogyny by Venus, who brings his statue to life to be his lover. So he gets the statue that he's created. Finally, this final scene also resonates with Euripides' Alcestis, in which another wronged wife and mother is brought back from the dead. I won't get into the details of that, but the sublimity of this moment, the way in which the play as a work of art elicits awe in its readers and audiences, self-consciously depends upon and comments on our narrative and generic expectations, as well as on the previous cultural archive of stories that are embedded in an intertextual web that includes the current production of the play, whether in Shakespeare's time or our own. So every time this moment is reproduced, it's not just a reproduction of the play, it's a reproduction of all those texts that the play is referring to, right? This is the main thrust of my argument, really, and we'll come back to that. This finale of The Winter's Tale is a highly orchestrated moment, of what I am defining as emotive intertextuality. It draws attention to the ways emotions are elaborated in narrative scripts and expectations, some of them impossible to trace, but others, like stories, plays, and myths, functioning as immanent markers of our highly culturally constructed emotional lives. The more theorized attention, and I'm going to talk a little bit about emotive intertextuality now, and then we'll come back to the play. The more theorized attention to intertextuality and such developments as the new Ovidianism, which is something that has happened in studies of Renaissance literature, these have coincided with the affective turn, which is the widespread attention to emotion that has swept the social and cognitive sciences in the last 2 decades and has reframed and initiated new kinds of research in literary studies and across the humanities. More recently, we're witnessing a focus on positive affect, or what they're calling a happiness turn, as the bias toward accounting for negative affects like anger, jealousy, and melancholy has given way to more complex theorizations and categorizations of positive emotions as well. The cognitive and social sciences have provided ever finer evidence that narrative is a foundational patterning principle of our experience of emotions. And Patrick Colm-Hogan has outlined the privileged role of stories and story-making in the processes of encoding and elaborating the lived experience of emotion. Emotive intertextuality, it turns out, actually characterizes our everyday emotional lives, because our experiences of emotion are dependent on previous narratives, stories, and myths. And I'm borrowing the term emotive actually from, it has 2 different senses, right? It's emotive just in the sense that these intertexts are creating the emotion in the moment of the literature, but I'm also borrowing the term theoretically from William Reddy, who talks about emotives as articulations of emotions that are there but are illegible, right? Hard to define at that moment in time. Okay. The things that are, so our everyday experiences of emotions are dependent on previous narrative stories and myths. And not just the culturally constructed portions of what we regard as our emotions. As we learn more about the plasticity of the brain, we're learning that our physiological responses are intimately bound with our sociocultural responses in a continuous loop, as our narratives are formed by our neurons, and our neurons are redirected and reformed by our narratives. So it isn't even just a divide between what we experience as cultural and our biological experiences. It's actually a reciprocal kind of loop. But this process of our intertextual existence is undetectable in the everyday experience of emotion. We do not consciously notice that, for instance, our grief is patterned on Hamlet's, or our neighbor's grief, or that our joy is elaborated by the Apple commercial we watched last night, or the story that we read on Facebook. In literature, however, we do sometimes notice the way previous stories, myths, and narratives of cultural expectations shape the emotional experience of characters, especially in the most self-conscious kinds of intertextual literature. We notice, for instance, that when Shakespeare says his mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun, he is structuring his experience of love and desire on Petrarch's, even in opposition to it. We see that the suffering of Lavinia and Titus Andronicus is patterned on the Ovidian story of Procne and Philomela. Self-consciously intertextual literature displays this emotive intertextuality to the highest degree, so it occupies an important place in our understanding of emotion, laying bare and making evident the networks of social and cultural codes that influence our experiences of emotions themselves. As a scholar of literature, I'm interested in pursuing this intertextual nature of emotion. In the larger work from which this is a piece, I situate The Winter's Tale in a broader examination of positive emotions as they are constituted in Shakespeare's works. I focus on the plays not solely as documents of social history, but also as participating structures in the continuous work of defining and evaluating the lived experience of emotion. My work traces how positive emotions, especially big, diffuse ones, such as happiness and well-being, are codified in these works in their original staging and across times and cultures as the plays are continually reproduced. So, back to the play. Before he's taken from his mother and dies, apparently from grief. Sometimes he shows up in this scene as a ghost, by the way. Like a lot of productions have a little kid standing in the back watching the reunion. But anyway. Before he's taken from his mother and dies, apparently from grief, separation, and shame for her, Mamilius, the son, famously tells his mother, who asks him to tell a merry or a sad tale, that he says, a sad tale's best for winter, to his mother. The play, therefore, is a sad tale, right? It's called The Winter's Tale, and so it's neat how Shakespeare does that. In the mouth of the child says, this is going to be a sad story, right? Now, the play, therefore, is a sad tale, which meant primarily not sad in the sense of depressed. It meant weighty, or serious, or steadfast, actually, also. And it was just beginning to take on the secondary meaning of sorrowful, a meaning that is first traced in the Ovid as late as 1300. That's pretty late. The Winter's Tale plays with both senses of sadness, as Leontes, his mistaken and violent jealousy creates profound social consequences, as well as misery for Hermione and many of the other characters. From the start, Hermione is defined by her resistance to the culturally pervasive cuckold narrative that has been set loose in the play to incriminate her. At her trial, Hermione challenges Leontes to compare the chaste truth of her life before his accusation to her present unhappiness as the target of his spectacular jealousy. And this is what she says. She says a lot. She has great speeches in this, but this is a piece. You, my lord, best know, who least will seem to do so, my past life hath been as continent, as chaste, as true as I am now unhappy, which is more than history can pattern, though devised and played to take spectators. In this moment of crisis in the play, Hermione has been brought forth to trial shortly after giving birth, and against all cultural health practices, because there was supposed to be a waiting period there. She's had her infant sent to death, and she seems destined to be tortured and killed for treason for an adultery that she's not committed. She is unhappy indeed, as unhappy in this period meant primarily unfortunate or unlucky, rather than depressed or joyless. And her present misery is defined in contrast to her more fortunate past. Her speeches during this trial scene are notable pieces of what Sarah Ahmed has called Western culture's unhappiness archive, as she defends herself by pointing to her vulnerability in relation to the king and the larger culture so ready to suspect her fidelity. As Ahmed points out, gendered scripts are essentially happiness scripts, as they provide a set of instructions for what women and men must do in order to be happy, whereas happiness is what follows being natural, whereby happiness is what follows being natural or good. So Hermione's unhappiness as a female character who has apparently followed a gendered script, that is, she's been continent, chaste, and true, it operates as a condemnation of that highly contingent script, which is proven to be so risky for both genders in this play. Happiness and unhappiness are also defined in this scene in relation to story, to history, right? She's more unhappy than history can pattern. Right, that's an interesting line. She says that she's more unhappy than history can pattern, though devised and played to take spectators. In doing so, she draws attention precisely to the ways it is being captured on a stage at that very moment. It's highly ironic for her to say so. Through this irony, the play highlights the ways happiness and unhappiness are culturally constructed through these very narratives. In Shakespeare's primary and closely contemporary source for the play, Pandosto, Robert Greene's Pandosto, and I'll show you what that looks like, just to remind you. The happiness of the characters is framed as a function of fortune's fickle influence on human affairs. At the start, the king and queen of Bohemia, Pandosto and Bellaria, are happy because fortune allows them to be so. And I'll tell you how it starts. I'm going to read you a little portion of it. They had not been married long, but fortune, willing to increase their happiness, lent them a son, so adorned with the gifts of nature, as the perfection of the child greatly augmented the love of the parents and the joys of their commons. Insomuch that the Bohemians, to show their inward joys by outward actions, made bonfires and triumphs throughout all the kingdom, appointing jousts and tourneys for the honor of their young prince. So fortune first allows such a multiplication of joys, but quickly the romance plot is set in motion when, quote, fortune, envious of such happy success, willing to show some sign of her inconstancy, turned her wheel and darkened their bright sun of prosperity with the misty clouds of mishap and misery. So the personified fortune in this romance is envious, and it's her fickle will that generates joy or sorrow. I'm going to make sure I'm not going to go over time, so how am I doing?
Oh, in 20 minutes.
Revising Pandosto, in which, and I should say in Pandosto, the queen dies and she's not reborn, and her daughter narrowly escapes the incestuous advances of her father, Shakespeare also redefines happiness. Rather than focusing on the difficult journey that's the main matter of Greene's romance, the play elaborates on the intense emotional interactions that are produced by Leontes' jealousy and dilates on this pivotal trial scene. Hermione's description of her present state as unhappy both points to Pandosto's characterization of happiness as dependent on fortune, that is, she's unhappy in the fact that she's been quite unlucky at that point, but it also suggests a more modern notion of happiness as a state of joy or contentedness, which she's lost, right? In those lines, you can see both of those resonances. Just as the play elaborates the multiple meanings of sadness, it articulates happiness as an emotional category under strain, highlighting a residual notion that is metamorphosing in the period from this Boethian and Augustinian emphasis on happenstance and fortune to a modern one emphasizing choice and internalized affective pleasure. The emotive intertextuality of the play creates a dialogue between Pandosto and The Winter's Tale that reveals one structure of feeling converting to another, as happiness moves from being a passive state of good fortune to a behavior and a moral choice. Hermione's unhappiness is not just a lack of fortune, It's also contrasted to the continence, chastity, and truth of her life so far. And all of these are conditions not determined by fate, but by her own agency, her choice to be restrained, sexually delimited, and honest. And in the period, honest meant monogamous, right? Her unhappy state is set in contrast to her happier past, a past that she defines as one marked by the exercise of her will to restrain her choices and desires. That restraint, it is implied, is also happiness itself. To be happy is to be fortunate, but it's also to be careful, restrained, and pure, if that purity is read in terms of bodily or humoral containment. This is a moral kind of happiness. It actually has its roots in Aristotle and the idea of eudaimonia. Not joy or merriness, this kind of positive emotion is defined by its lack of action and its reserve. It's remarkable in that it's moving away from a residual understanding of happiness as dependent on fortune and toward a modern sense of it as defined by individual choices, and even toward our contemporary notion of happiness, which sometimes is discussed as a right, right? We have a right to be happy. It's in American culture that might be true. Happiness is being revised and rewritten by the play's pervasive emotive intertextuality, and the happiness narratives involved include myths as well as stories and cultural scripts. As the play moves from the winter world of Sicilia to the summer world of Bohemia through the highly self-conscious device of the allegorical time, who moves the plot forward 16 years, and that's the other reason why it's kind of an exception in Shakespeare's canon, because it's divided, it's bifurcated in half by time. Time comes out as an allegorical figure and says, and now we're going to pass over 16 years and come back to the story, which is an indication that Shakespeare didn't really care about the 16 years that intervened and really wanted to come back to this question of what it means for this community, that these horrible things have happened at the beginning. So as it comes through this self-conscious device, we come back to the plot after the 16 years. The play also is drawing attention to its status as myth, right? There's also this mythic underlying narrative going on here. Its primary mythic source is the Proserpina tale, which is about the abducted daughter who has to reside with Hades during the winter, or Pluto in the Latin, has to reside with Hades during the winter until she's reunited with her mother, Ceres, in the spring. And I won't get into that much detail about that, but it's a foundational myth in classical culture, and it comes up in lots of texts. Northrop Frye has called this play a solstitial play, because it's about the solstice, right? It's about the seasons changing. And Jonathan Bate points out that The Winter's Tale is Shakespeare's most overtly mythic play title, right? It announces a link sorry, between characters and their emotions on the one hand, and the seasons on the other. In many critical discussions of this most mythic of Shakespeare's plays, the definition of a myth as a narrative structuring of human experience is assumed, but in fact there's disagreement about what constitutes a myth. What's the difference between a myth and just a story, right? This is actually a difficult question. It's useful in this case to return to René Girard's insistence that all myths are generated by a communal act of violence. In the case of The Winter's Tale, this mythic violence is directed primarily at Hermione and her children, and the exposure of Perdita to death that is ordered by Leontes and performed by Antigonus, it stands in for Hades' abduction of Proserpina in the underlying myth. The myth that structures the play, then, also structures its violence, and this explains in part the bizarre development of Leontes' unfounded jealousy and rage at the beginning of the play. As it is deployed here, the Proserpina myth is not just about the death and regeneration that accompany the seasons, but the violence to women that is generative of that myth itself, and the grief that is its feminized response. The awe demanded at the end of the play requires the accommodation of a new perspective on the cultural narrative of the cuckold that resulted in Hermione's 16-year death, and it exposes the violence at the heart of the play's many other intertexts, provoking thinking on the consequences for the community of such emotional narratives. So returning to the final statue scene, maybe I'll just jump ahead here. Too modern. Returning to the final statue scene, the Pygmalion story operates as a new intertextual resource in the play for the production of awe. But it also draws attention in its explicit rewriting to the overthrow of the ungenerative misogynistic narratives that have killed Mamilius and almost killed Hermione and Perdita. In Ovid's representation of the myth in Metamorphoses, Pygmalion, and in this retelling, right, Pygmalion has become a woman, and there's a whole lot we can say about that. But in Ovid's representation of the myth in Metamorphoses, Pygmalion chooses to carve his ivory girl as a response to witnessing the first prostitutes, who are turned to promiscuity and then to stone as a punishment for their denial of Venus's divinity. Their stoniness is similar to the stoniness of Pygmalion's statue, and it suggests that both the propedes, those first prostitutes, and the statue girl are removed from human sensory and emotional life. Pygmalion's statue, however, is highly eroticized by both Pygmalion and the narrator in Ovid's Metamorphoses. He says, "With many a touch he tries it. Is it flesh or ivory?" Right? So it's something that goes on like that for quite a while. This eroticization works to emphasize the creatureliness or the liveliness of the stone even before Venus acquiesces to giving it life. And when she does reward Pygmalion's misogynistic artistry, he, quote, "His heart was torn with wonder and misgiving, delight and terror that it was not true." The statue of Hermione similarly functions as an important object upon which happiness narratives cohere, but it does not elicit only good or bad feelings. So just to clarify, right, when Pygmalion gets a statue, he's confused with happiness and fear, but he's also getting what he wants. That's a happiness narrative, right? This is a different one. Instead, it evokes its Ovidian nature as a commentary on the ambivalence of desire. The Pygmalion story is one of the few happy endings in Metamorphoses, happy in the more traditional sense that we think of it. It's one of the few tales in which a god intervenes to improve rather than destroy mortal life. Included in Book 10 as one of many representations of potentially transgressive desires that are accommodated by Ovid's amoral narration, it serves to evoke a kind of even-handed sympathy for the man who loves the statue, even though this union will produce the line that leads the line, that is in terms of ancestry, that leads directly in the next tale to Cinrus and Mira's incest. I won't get into all that, but there's a whole other thing going on there. Pygmalion's story operates here as an intertext to codify and elaborate the complexly tragicomic happiness of the moment when misogyny is temporarily and partially defeated and Perdita is restored. So the Ovidianism of the scene patterns its emotional content, concluding on a tragicomic note of restrained joy and persistent grief. In addition to highlighting the play's emotive intertextuality, the artistic self-consciousness of the final scene of The Winter's Tale facilitates not just the play's pervasive questioning of the nature and value of art, but also its dilation on the contingency of happiness. The faith invoked in the final scene may suggest, on the one hand, that the Ovidian pagan myth, the lost daughter Proserpina, has been shadowing the action of the play as being overwritten in the final moments by the central Christian myth of redemption and grace. And this reading is supported and also troubled by the threatening religious language surrounding Paulina, as Leontes calls her a mankind witch earlier in the play. She's potentially heretic at one point in the play. And then she assures us in this scene that she will not be performing the transformation with wicked powers. You'll also notice that she's wearing black and white. She's a dangerous character. The primary meaning of faith in the period, however, as in it is required that you awake your faith, it was the quality of fulfilling one's trust or promise, faithfulness, loyalty, fidelity, trustworthiness. That's the OED definition. Faith, therefore, in this period is fundamentally contractual. When Paulina asks her audience to awake their faith, she's preparing them for the destabilizing social experience of awe that will be facilitated by the pseudo-metamorphosis of Hermione's statue from stone to flesh. She suggests that they must have faith both in her as the commissioner of the statue and by extension the playwright as creator of this unconventional and unexpected narrative closure. The scene dramatizes the experience of awe to produce awe, and in its overt Ovidianism and emotive intertextuality, it emphasizes the metamorphic qualities of awe itself. According to social psychologists, Michel Chioda et al., who's actually on our campus, in their summary of the research, awe, as an emotion, is usually defined by the experience of, quote, perceptual vastness and the need for cognitive accommodation. So the experience of awe, unlike the experience of most other positive emotions, moves the individual toward changes in their cognitive schema. Awe is an affective state that encourages thinking and produces rational reflection. And in the play, this moment of awe and wonder allows the fictional world to critique itself, forcing the audience to accommodate new understandings of the constructed community that is broken and partially amended over the course of the play. According to Datcher, Kellner, and Jonathan Haidt, who are other emotion researchers, awe is a particularly understudied emotion in the cognitive sciences, and it's rarely included in taxonomies of positive emotions. Literature, however, and especially dramatic literature, is filled with moments that produce awe. And the final scene of The Winter's Tale is only a more self-conscious example of what often occurs in moments of dramatic intensity or generic closure. Literature, therefore, offers an important location for reading awe, as it is so deeply embedded in aesthetics, in addition to spiritual and moral discourses. In this scene, the vastness of time is the most emphasized cognitive challenge, as well as perhaps the recognition of the human lifespan in the reunion of Perdita with her mother. Confronting this vastness, the characters and the audience restructure their attitudes together in a reinterpretation of the play's misogyny and violence, and a celebration of its art. What we witness in this moment of dramatic intertextuality is the way awe is produced in a moment of social and shared risk. When Paulina asks her audiences to awake their faiths, she operates in a highly overdetermined moment of intertextuality, where multiple narratives surrounding women intersect, only some of which can be traced as stories, myths, or other highly articulated cultural narratives. Hermione, the mistrusted wife, will not remain dead, as she is in Green's Pandosto. Instead, she will be returned from the dead and honored, as Alcestis is in the scene's Euripidean source, so in an alternate intertext as they all play into each other. The statue that represents the object of Pygmalion's misogynistic desire will be re-metamorphosed by a female artist, reversing the misogyny upon which it was based. Leontes, the man who believed himself a cuckold, will be given back his wife, who he has metaphorically killed. Awe is the emotion that will accompany these many transformations of cultural narratives and their produced understandings, and it depends upon Paulina risking her own life as she worries that she'll be charged with witchcraft. All of the characters and the audience also embrace risk and trust in this contractual sense of faith with Paulina, allowing the play to move them toward different cognitive schema. Whether produced in Shakespeare's time, where these narratives might have been more current, or our own, where they are our history, the play elaborates on the risky social experience of awe. And this is a recent production, very recent, and in fact it's about to come, it's from this season. It just closed on January 16th, I believe. And it's eventually, we think it will be available for wider circulation, movie version of the stage play. And it was also simulcast all over the world, so a lot of people have actually seen this production with Judi Dench. I haven't seen it myself, but I will in the next couple of weeks. I get to see it at the end of March. The intensity of awe as an emotion is ultimately replaced by reconciliation and emphases on joy and comfort, but the scene is characteristically tragicomic, highlighting both pain and pleasure. Leontes says, for instance, he says, "This affliction has a taste as sweet as any cordial comfort." That's a characteristically tragicomic moment there. In its final moments, the play actually returns to the pervasive melancholy that has characterized it, even its happy resolution, happy in quotes, as Paulina announces that she will, in the very end she says, "I will wing me to some withered bough, and there my mate, that's never to be found again, lament till I am lost." And I should back up, the reason that she is in a state of grief for most of the play is that it's her husband Antigonus who's asked to expose Perdita. And so he goes to Bohemia, leaves her there, and then very famously in Shakespeare, he exits, quote, "pursued by a bear," and ends up dead. So, so he is killed off at the beginning of the play. She spends most of the play, we assume, in a state of grief, and ends on this moment, in this note of grief. "She will wing me to some withered bough, and there my mate, that's never to be found again, lament till I am lost." Although Paulina is married off, by the way, in the final decree by Leontes, he says, "Oh, you can have Camillo, my faithful servant, and it'll work out well because you're the same generation." That's basically his theory there. She is married off in the final moments of the play. She never responds. She never says, "Oh, wonderful, I've always liked Camillo." There's nothing like that at the end of the play. Instead, there's nothing, right? She just says, "You're married to Camillo." She never responds. She has no more lines in the play, and we never hear her accept this compensatory marriage. Her silence resonates more than this forced social silencing, and so it's her lament, her grief, that brings the play to a close. This unhappy kind of happiness is characteristic of Shakespeare's problem plays and his romances, and The Winter's Tale shares with Shakespeare's other romances an interest in narrative structure and the boundaries of its tragicomic genre. So it gives you the kind of happy ending and pushes the boundaries of what that is. Like the other romances, the play is also, as Donna Wares has illustrated, particularly engaged in examining the complex ways affect and reason can be encoded and elicited by imaginative texts. In its tragicomic, emotional complexity, the play explores happiness and unhappiness and the ways this binary functions to define the fictionalized social roles of its characters. In his rewritings of these multiple imaginative and cultural narratives, Shakespeare redefines happiness as a state created not through the interventions of fortune's wheel, but through an active structuring of experience by myth and art and the awe they can produce. The vastness evoked in the final scene of wonder generates an expansion of awareness to include larger scales of time, the human lifespan and even geologic time, as implied by this focus on stone and the stone of the statue. This turn toward wider frames for understanding human experience is suggested by Pandosto's original story, which is also subtitled The Triumph of Time, right? But it's transmuted through these intertexts and through Ovidianism too, especially because of the Pygmalion story, from meaning simply that time will reveal truth to suggesting that time will allow for symbolic remetamorphosis, for the animation of stone perceived as inanimate. The play grounds both its structuring myth of loss and reconciliation, as well as its central representative climax in the previous narratives of Green's Pandosto, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Euripides' Alcestis, and the many solstice myths of regeneration. And it revels in this emotive intertextuality, drawing attention to its own cultural work in patterning the lived experience of emotion. The sad tale told in winter, that is The Winter's Tale, is a meditation on happiness, suggesting the ways it depends upon social structures and the narratives, myths, and stories that circulate or cohere around it as an emotion category. As a tragicomedy, it resists the happy, meaning either fortunate or joyful, ending in favor of a more measured, contented kind of solace. Historically, it captures the transition from a primary notion of happiness as passive good fortune toward one associated more clearly with an Aristotelian notion of morally virtuous behaviors and joyful affects. It also reveals the ways happiness and unhappiness are linked to gendered scripts and narratives associated with gendered behaviors and desires. Looking at the way happiness circulates and is elaborated by the many texts aligned in this intertextual network that characterizes the play, we see the history and assumptions behind our own Euro-American quest for happier behaviors. Happiness in the modern sense of joy is always contingent, and happy individuals are always vulnerable, not mainly because happiness is produced by but because unhappiness is produced by bad human behaviors and choices, but because it is produced by multiple narratives, articulating various and sometimes conflicting desires. Without the sublime moment of awe of the statue metamorphosing to flesh, where these narratives can be reimagined and reframed, we continue our lived experience of happiness within those narratives that shape it. Thank you.